Happy Tuesday, gardeners. My name is Katie Rose Watson, and I am from the food and garden website, therosetable.com. And I am joined by legendary gardener Paul Zimmerman. Paul, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's like 70 degrees. I started pruning my roses last Saturday, cleaning up the gardens, and it's just, spring is sprunging.
Perfect. It is also a beautiful day here in Dallas. It's 70. It's beautiful. I can't even wait to go out in the garden. And we're so excited to talk to all of you today with Jackson and Perkins about pruning roses, which is
Yes.
so essential. So, Paul, can you talk to us first of all why it's so important for rose health and growth to prune?
Yeah, so pruning roses can get very leggy and they just get out of hand sometimes. So pruning is actually, you cut them back, but that also spurs new growth. And a lot of times the roses will bloom better on younger wood or newer wood than older wood. And that's what pruning is about. I've actually changed from using the word pruning. I call it rejuvenating. Because
Oh,
in
I
essence,
love that.
yeah, that's kind of what you're doing. If you think about it, Katie Rose, when
Mhm.
you prune your roses, you'll see, new basil breaks from the bottom. Those new canes coming from the bottom, new fresh leaves coming out, and fresh canes putting out. They're going to be highly productive. So you're actually taking off the old growth and rejuvenating the rose to produce your new flowers for the season.
Very nice. And what are some of the key tools that every gardener should have for pruning roses? Are there any tools that you would consider a must have?
Yeah, very thick skin or something to cover your arms. That's very important. We were
I do
talking
have
about
some battle scars.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So do I. I quite often look like a drug addict at the end of pruning season. It's pretty bad. Yeah. There's a couple basic things you want to have. You want to have a really good pair of secateurs or clippers or whatever you want to call them, and you want what's called a bypass pair. And what do I mean by that? That means instead of the blade, an anvil pair is where the blade hits something solid and stops. I think you see that pretty well from my hand right there.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. And a bypass is where the blades bypass each other. That's called a
Mhm.
bypass pair of secateurs or clippers. And that creates a nice clean cut by going straight through the cane as opposed to mashing the cane like that. So a
Mhm.
good pair of secateurs is really good. And if you can spend the money to get a really nice pair, it's worth it. The one I use is Felco. I've got the pair with the rotating handle. Mine are probably 25 years old. I've gone through 3 or 4 blades that I've been able to replace with them. I pruned, I don't know, 30, 40,000 roses with those things over the years. So that's a really good thing. The other thing is a pair of loppers, basically a pair of secateurs with longer handles. That's not all
Mhm.
that really basically is. And that's so you can get into the rose itself and get into the thicker canes. A small pruning saw, the ones that fold up, those are really good as well. So, and then a good pair of gloves, whatever you want, either gauntlet gloves or some sort of sleeve protection. We talked about a product called Farmer's Defense, which is that I use, which is basically it's a wicking sleeve that's very tight and then just closes up here on your arm like that. And I've had really good luck with thorns not coming through those things. So that's your basic pruning toolkit.
That. Very nice. Guys, comment as you are watching this and let us know your pruning questions. I know last week in part one of this 3-part rose growing series, we had lots of questions about pruning. So
Yes.
drop those comments and we will hopefully get to all of your questions.
Yeah. Rose pruning time.
So, when pruning roses, what are some signs that tell us we're doing it correctly or incorrectly?
Well, so first and foremost, I think one of the things and the way to start answering that question is don't be intimidated by pruning. It's in my years of doing this, it's the one thing that intimidates new rose. I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to cut it wrong. Do that. The rose is actually very forgiving. Even if you do something wrong or cut something too low, it will grow back. So that's the thing to keep in mind. So don't be afraid to do that. The basic rules of thumb I would use are go slow if you're new.
Mhm.
It says, okay, I'm going to prune this rose to 18 inches high, for example, or 24 inches high, whatever. Maybe prune it halfway initially and just sort of step back and take a look at it. So go slow and kind of get used to it. The other thing you hear about the outward facing bud eye, and that is relatively important. And I'll explain it as best I can. If you look at a rose cane, there are these little bumps on the rose cane, and they kind of go around the cane in a spiral staircase kind of manner, and there's a little nodule, and that's when you cut above that, about a quarter of an inch above it. That's where the new growth is going to come from, the new cane, the new stem, whatever it may be. So if you have the center of your plant here, you want to try to cut bud eyes that face away from the center. because the new growth will always go in the direction the bud eye is facing when you cut above that bud eye. So that's a fairly important thing. That gives you a nice shape like this in a flower as opposed to a shape like that in a bush. Gives you that nice kind of open shape. So those are the main things to do, but go slow. If you're new, just take your time, go
Mhm.
slow. If you're not sure, just stop. But don't worry about making a mistake. The plant will grow back. It'll be absolutely fine.
No, and I think a lot of people, they don't look at pruning as really shaping the rose. And I
Yes.
want to give a shout out to our neighbor out at the lake house, Carol. So we'll ask her, how tall does this grow? And she'll say it grows as tall as you want it to grow. And I love
Yeah.
that. She's such a fearless gardener. She's not afraid to cut things.
Yeah.
So for instance, pruning one of my roses, it's right next to my grill. And I noticed that over the years, it's kind of like inched more and more into my grilling space. So this year I went ahead and, cut that cane so it would start growing more away from the grill. So don't be afraid to shape your roses, everybody.
Yeah, and that's what pruning is a lot of times. It is shaping it for the year. And you can also shape them all season long, after you deadhead, for example. Don't be afraid to bring the rose down by about a third. You don't have, so you can do that all year long. But the pruning is the real chance to get in and rejuvenate. You look for dead wood, diseased wood. Those are the things you obviously want to get out of there as well, because the bush is defoliated in most instances. You can really see what's going on.
So that brings us to a really good point, actually. You mentioned year round. When is the best time to prune roses in the spring? And does it depend on the type of rose? And does it depend on your growing zone?
Well, yeah. So it's going to depend on your zone and your climate. That's the key to the whole thing. My rule of thumb is I bloom when the forsythia blooms. Forsythia is a beautiful shrub with a yellow flower. That's when I prune. Not
Mhm.
everybody has forsythia, so what you could always do is get your zip code and Google your last frost date. Just last frost date, enter your zip code, count back about 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks or so. That's the time to start pruning. So I start pruning March 1st, for example. My last frost date's the middle of April, so that's a 6 week window that you can go with. That's a real good time. Now, if you live in a climate that has no dormant season at all, you never get a freeze like when I lived in Los Angeles, for example. I generally prune in like late December, early January.
Mhm. And here in Dallas, my last frost date is somewhere in mid-March. So I typically prune Valentine's Day, but I'm really
Yeah.
late this year, guys. And that's okay. That's okay. It's been,
No, it's fine. Yeah,
yeah, I
if you
think
prune
people
late,
get
it's not
in
the end of
this.
the world.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think people get in this mindset that they like, oh, I've missed it and now I can't prune, but you still can.
Well, what you could do too, if you're really late, like I had one year, I was traveling and I was just really late. So what I did
Mhm.
is I just went into them because they were starting to leaf out, in some cases almost beginning to like form buds. And I said, well, I don't want to lose my spring flowering. That's what I've been waiting also winter for.
Mhm.
So I went and did a light hand. I did a little bit of trimming, a little bit of cleaning up, and then what I did is I let them go through their spring flush, and then I actually did a prune after their spring flush.
See, I don't hear nearly enough garden sites talking about that. And you've mentioned that before. So you also do a pretty heavy summer prune or
I
a
do a
light
good
summer prune?
I do a light summer prune, taking back no more than about a third.
Mhm.
But I like to do a summer prune, just take them back by a third because they're gonna go dormant in the summer for me anyway. And that's a
Mhm.
chance to just get in there, get the dead wood out, clean them up, see what's going
Mhm.
on. For me, summer's when the Japanese beetles come, so they're gonna eat the foliage anyway. So why not just go ahead and clean them up while the beetles are there? Because the beetles
Mhm.
are drawn to your garden by the scent of the flower. So if there's no flower, no scent, less beetle damage. And then when the beetles are gone, they start to wake up again. So yeah, I'm a heavy believer in a summer cleanup.
That is such a good tip. And this is why we love talking to Paul, everybody. Yay. Also,
I
we
made all
are
the
giving
mistakes, so you don't
away.
have to.
Right. We are giving away 6 roses later in this live. So we've just posted the link for you to register to win a rose in the chat. So check the chat and just type in your email and you'll be registered to win a free rose from Jackson and Perkins. And we are, of course, huge fans of Jackson and Perkins. Have some amazing roses there if you have not done any spring
Yeah, a
shopping.
lot of good stuff.
So very exciting. Susan wants to know, do you prune climbing roses differently than rose bushes? Great question, Susan.
That's a fabulous question, Susan. I'm really glad you asked it. The answer is yes. It's a very different philosophy with climbing roses. And the best way to understand this is that the anatomy of a climbing rose is different than the anatomy of a bush rose. Bush rose, you've got the base, you've got the canes, and they're all pretty much similar that way. With a climbing rose, you've got basically two kinds of canes you're dealing with. You have what I call the main canes. They're the ones that come from the base, essentially, maybe a foot off the ground. Those are the big, heavy structural canes that get 8, 9, 10, 12, 14 feet or something along those lines. Those are the ones that you want to train horizontally, like I talk about quite a bit. Then what comes off those main canes are called laterals, or side shoots is the other term that I've heard. Laterals is the one that I use a lot. That's what bears the flowers. So if you've got the main cane like this, and you trained it somewhat horizontal, let me see if I can get back a little bit, like this, the side shoots are coming off like this, and that's what bears your flowers. So keeping that in mind, here's a couple rules of thumb. Never, ever, ever cut the main canes back. Why? Because a climbing rose wants to grow first and then flower. That's why you hear the term for climbing roses: sleep, creep, leap. The third year for a climbing rose is generally when it comes into maturity. So you want to let it grow to the size it wants to be, then train it correctly. Then it will put off those laterals and those side shoots. Now, you can tip the main cane a little bit, but don't prune that back. With the laterals, and you can do this all season long, you can cut them back to within 12 to 14 inches of the main cane. So if your main cane's here, your laterals out here, you can cut them back straight along those lines. Don't worry about which way the bud eye is facing. It's totally irrelevant on a climbing rose. And then basically then it becomes an aesthetic. If you want a very tight kind of a espaliered look, prune those laterals to 12 to 14 inches of the main cane. I've got a picket fence where I have a rose that I like to be more casual. I prune the laterals to about 2 feet to 2.5 feet. It's a more cascading, weeping kind of look. So main canes, laterals, don't cut the main canes. You can trim the laterals every season out after blooming. That's the key to climbing roses. And I'm really glad you asked that, because a lot of people are mystified by that.
What about a hybrid tea versus a shrub rose?
So with a shrub rose or a hybrid tea, and I'm going to be sort of a generality here. So, and leads into a great discussion about how blah, blah, easy for me to say, how tall or how short should I prune my roses? Here's the answer to that question. What's the rose's job in the garden? That's the key. So the method of pruning hybrid tea roses, 18 inches high, 12 inches high in some cases, that's designed to produce long stems for either the florist table, Valentine's Day, or for the rose show table. So if your goal with a hybrid tea is long stems, prune hard, because you're going to get less flowers, bigger flowers, longer stems, if that's your goal. If your goal is more flowers, then prune higher. So with a lot of my bush roses, because I have a rose garden, bush garden, I don't have a cutting garden, I prune my roses to maybe 2 feet, 3 feet, in some cases 4 feet, depending how big the rose wants to ultimately be. So what's your goal? You know, you can prune a hybrid tea to 18 inches, less flowers, longer stems, or you can prune it to 3 feet, shorter stems, more flowers.
Renee says, thank you so much for the explanation on the climbing roses. You're so welcome. Renee says, why Paul will be here all day.
Yeah, so, I've got a lot of videos on my YouTube channel if you want to go there, or on my website, which is paulzimmermanroses.com. Lots of information on climbing roses. And I know it mystifies people like crazy. So feel free to pop over there. There's a lot of videos which illustrates more clearly what I'm doing.
Yes, he's literally out in the garden in a lot of his videos showing you how he prunes his roses.
I'm actually going to do the pruning climbing one again. I did it like 15 years ago before it was HD. And so I'm going to go, I've got a rose that I'm about ready to prune. So I'm going to go ahead and shoot a brand new version of that video.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Mariana wants to know, she says her rose bush is overgrown. How does she get it back into shape?
So overgrown, some of it's going to depend on how old it is. So one of the other things about pruning is, and I talk about rejuvenating, is taking out an old cane. And this is a rather scary thing to do for the very first time. So if you have a rose that's got an old wooded cane that isn't producing anymore, it's got a lot of bark on it, rather than cut it back to like 18 inches, 2 feet, or something along those lines, and it may come back, it may not, I will actually take that cane off at the ground. That will stimulate new canes to grow. And like I said, it's very frightening to do, but I did it with a rose called Rev d'Or, which is an old Noisette climber rose that I've had for about 20 years. And it had gotten woody, and I only had about 3 canes on it, basically. And one cane was, I mean, it was like this thick and wooded over. And so I went in and I just literally cut it off at the ground. And within about 3 months, I had 5 brand new canes.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's very frightening, but it works. But if you got several old canes, what I would advise you do, take out 1 or 2 this year, take out 1 or 2 next year, take out 1 or 2 next year after that. Make it a 3-year project. Don't try to do it all at once.
And speaking of frightening, this is why I always say the garden is very Game of Thrones. People who don't think gardening is exciting have never gardened, which is
Yeah,
why I think I'm on year like 12 or something of what I like to call Game of Thorns. And every year I just basically track which of my roses opens first, and then they win the Game of Thorns that year.
that's a
So
great idea. I like that.
if anybody wants to follow Game of Thorns, go to therosetable.com and bookmark it, because that's I do that every single spring on the gardening tab. Okay, let's see. Charlotte says, I have a high retaining wall and I'm wondering if a landscape and climbing rose could be planted to cascade over the wall.
Absolutely, yes, is your answer to that.
That sounds
So Charlotte, which you want to pick a climbing, even like a rambler or a repeat blooming rambler that has what I call relaxed growth habit. We were talking about Peggy Martin earlier.
yes.
Great rose for this kind of thing because a lot of the modern climbers have stiff canes. So when you get to that wall, it's going to keep going up like that. But the lax habits will come over and will kind of weep over the wall. And there's actually a garden in France that I was on one of my garden tours that I lead 2 years ago, and it was a castle, which everybody has, of course. And but there was a retaining
We're
wall.
circling back to that, by the way.
It was
That's amazing.
beautiful, but they had a retaining wall that was probably about 10 feet high. And what they had done is the top of the retaining wall, there was kind of lawn on the other side. They had planted the rambling roses, and they literally wept over and draped down the wall. I've got pictures of it. It was absolutely spectacular.
Wow.
So yeah, just make sure you get one that has a lax growth habit. And by lax, I mean not a stiff cane. That's the main thing you want to go for. Like a rambler, the noisettes, if you're in a warm climate, will weep like that. Hybrid musk, big shrubs will grow like that and will weep as well. But yes, beautiful effect, Charlotte. Go for it.
That sounds amazing. Sidebar, where was the castle, and how do we go on garden tours with you?
Oh, okay. Well, it was in central France. We did the Loire Valley. And yeah, go to my website. Again, paulzimmermanroses.com, about halfway down on the homepage. Garden tour information. I do a lot of them with a buddy of mine, Michael Marriott. He was with David Austin Roses for gazillion years. Oh, wow. And we're doing one in November. We're doing New Zealand and North and South Island. And then next February, a trip of a lifetime, Michael and I are co-leading a garden rose tour in India.
Oh my gosh. You hear it here first, folks. That sounds
absolutely amazing. There's room. Come. We'd love to have you join us. It's a lot of fun.
We've had a question from Instagram. Sandra says, I have an old rose, Editor McFarlane, and my mother-in-law says, cut it down more. And I just cut some. This rose is about 6 feet tall by the end of the summer. Any suggestions if I should prune it more than the 6 feet? She just pruned it.
Yeah. So again, the answer to that question is kind of what I talked about earlier. What's his job in the garden? I mean, Editor McFarlane, it was actually Horace McFarlane, one of the founders of the American Rose Society. You can prune it down to about 3 feet. I don't think I'd go much more than that because it's an old plant. But the other thing you do if you want to keep it at 6 feet, let it bloom. And then, when you deadhead it, go ahead and deadhead it back down. But maybe take it down about 4 feet. That might be a nice height. And then let it bloom and then deadhead it back down to 4 feet and just kind of do that all season long as opposed to only doing that hard prune once a year. With an older bush, you got to have a light hand with the pruning.
And just for everybody's knowledge, what would you consider an old rose bush?
Something that's probably getting to be 15, 20 years old. Okay. When a lot of the base is wooded over with bark and things like that, and you can take like a light steel brush and kind of brush some of the bark away to try to get the new bud eyes. But a lot of times those new bud eyes won't break. And with budded roses, it's a little different. With an own root rose, that's a whole different story. An own root rose, you can literally cut the thing down to the ground and it'll pop right back up again.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Impressive. Jonathan says, I planted a bare root climbing rose the year before last. Last year, it only had one stem growing on it, and I've still not seen one bud on it. What can I do to make it grow? How do you best plant a bare root rose?
Yeah, so Jonathan, so here's kind of a thing. If you have a rose, and I've got some one cane wonders in my garden as well. Over time, that's what happens. And I was taught by a gentleman named David Stone, who was the head gardener at Modest Font Abbey. And he said, basically, you want to shock the rose into growing. And what his philosophy was, and I do this, I'll cut the rose down to about 3 inches high. And two things are going to happen. One of two things is going to happen. It's going to grow like mad, or it's going to die. So, but it's not going to do well with
Game of Thrones, people.
Yeah, it's the roll of the dice, folks. I'm kid you not. More often than not, though, it works. It really does work because it just jolts the rose into producing brand new growth and brand new canes. Is what it does. It almost
Mhm.
shocks it into doing that essentially. So, but you may do that now. This is so Jonathan's 2 years old, year before last. Yeah, I cut that stem down to 12 inches and let's see what happens. That's what I would suggest you do. Yeah. And that
Doctor's
reminds me,
orders.
because his rose is a little young, I want to talk a little bit about what pruning young roses too. We talked about old roses. So when you
Yes.
plant your roses in the spring, obviously you're not going to prune them. You just planted them. The
Mhm.
following year, when they're 1 year old in your garden, use a light hand. I don't like to hard prune a 1 year old rose. I really just like to let it continue to settle in. Dead growth, weak growth, twiggy growth obviously always comes out. Use a light hand on a young plant.
Such a good point. And what
Yeah.
about miniature roses? How, what, still a third? What do you like to do for a miniature rose?
Miniature rose is really they're as forgiving as you can possibly get. You could actually take a pair of head shears and trim them, and they'd be absolutely fine. Yeah,
Easy,
they really
easy.
are good. Yeah, they're really, you can, yeah, I mean, you can prune them short, prune them tall, whatever you want to do. I mean, it's not going to matter. They're really almost they're very very forgiving miniature roses. Drift
Mhm.
roses are another example of a rose like that as well. Very easy rose. Just I actually with drift roses I prune them to the size I kind of want them to be and leave them alone.
I
Yeah,
love drift
again,
roses. Underrated. If you guys do not grow drift
yeah.
roses, look
Oh,
into it.
for mass landscaping, they're phenomenal. They're like the front of a border in a pot. Great group of roses. Yeah, Mayan is the one who
Mhm.
hybridized them. Wonderful roses.
And don't forget, guys, we are going to do a giveaway here very shortly. So be sure and go click on the link that's in the comments and
Yep.
register. And then you'll be registered to win one of the roses. And we're going to announce that here at the end of the live.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about Katie. We talked about something before we came on the air. I talked about the mechanism. If you have a lot of roses, for example, and this is being done, I used to do
Oh,
this when I
yes.
had my nursery. When I've got like 250, 300 roses in my garden. I know people have got like 400 or 500, 600 roses,
Oh,
and
my God.
you want to start hand pruning, but you've got to. They're all tall by now, as a general
Mhm.
rule of thumb. And you say, okay, I want to prune. I want to prune to 3 feet. I'm just throwing out a number here or something along those lines. We got to start pruning each one, dealing with that top growth, which you can do, and what I've done. And the Royal Horticultural Society did a test on this, and they couldn't tell the difference. So let's say I'm going to prune everything to 3 feet. That's what I've
Mhm.
decided I'm going to do. You get a pair of gas-powered head shears. I'm going to repeat that. Gas-powered head shears with the nice big long blade that goes like that. That kind of goes back and forth like that.
Mhm.
Go back and cut everything back to 3.5 feet with those head shears. Just go through and shear it all off. Get all that top growth out. Get it out of your garden. Now it's easier to work in the garden, easier to see what's going on. Then get the last half foot. Then you use your hand shears and your hand secateurs. But it's a really nice way to just very quickly wipe out all that stuff that's in your way, and then you can get in there and start doing the fine tuning after that fact.
I have to know just for myself too. What do you put all of your canes in? This is the bane of my existence. My dad throws them in a wheelbarrow and then deals with them after they're piled up. I like to kind of spread open a trash bag and throw them right in there. What do you do with your canes that you're cutting?
Yeah, well, we live in a rural area, so I've got a big, a black trash can that I basically get them
Mhm.
into initially. And then I've got a cart that goes behind our mower, and then I just basically go back into the woods and dump them in the woods.
Oh, I'm so
But
jealous.
yeah, I know,
Andy.
I know.
Oh
It's okay
man.
to hate me, Katie Rose. It's all right.
Paul's literally living my rose garden horse farm dreams.
Yeah, I would, Katie Rose, but get yourself a big old black garbage can, and then get yourself garbage bags that fit inside. Put them inside the can. It's easier to stuff them in the bag when it's open like that.
You know what? It's never even occurred to me, and
Yeah,
that is
that's the way I
that.
do it. Yeah, when I had a rose maintenance business in Los Angeles, that's how we did it. And I would, sometimes I'd cut them up into smaller pieces and just kind of like snip, snip, and drop them in the bag. Then basically
Mhm,
you can just cinch the bag up, lift it out of the can, put a new one in, and you're off and running.
mhm. Let's talk really quickly about leaving rough foliage for beneficial insects. We often hear about the
Yes.
importance of doing this. Why is this beneficial for overall garden health?
Yeah, so it used to be, clean up your garden in the fall. That was the rule of thumb, and we've discovered a whole lot more about this. So a lot of your beneficial insects, ladybugs, hoverflies, praying mantis, a lot of native bees as well, are very, which are our pollinators that pollinate our food supply. They overwinter in what's called rough foliage. That could be from perennials, grasses. So the foliage that's left over in the wintertime, they live in there. Where they also particularly live in are hollow stems. So like you think of like echinacea, flowers that are born in the end of long stems where they're hollow in the middle. They will actually overwinter in that hollow stem. So if you cut that back in the fall and throw it all away, you basically thrown away literally a beneficial bug bungalow, for lack of a better word. And you basically tossed them out of your garden. They won't be there next spring when the aphids arrive. So
Hmm.
that's why you don't cut back your rough foliage. The rule of thumb has become when you've got a week's worth of weather where it never gets below 50 degrees, even at night, that's when they're probably waking up. So that's the time you can start cleaning up the garden. But
Hmm.
even then, I'll take the hollow stems of the echinacea. I've got a couple of other plants that are like that as well, and I will lay them in the garden. Just leave them there until the summertime and clean them up in the summertime. So leave the rough foliage. It's incredibly important, and it's going to be your beneficial insect help next year.
That's really a Disney movie waiting to happen. Like Paul
Yeah,
and his little bug bungalow.
you're right.
Set up a
Beneficial
little
bug
hotel in the
bungalow.
summer.
I'm going to trademark that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, partying in
What
the
should
wintertime.
gardeners what should gardeners do if they've accidentally pruned too much, and can the rose recover?
Yeah, don't worry about it. And yes, the rose will recover.
Hmm.
They're
I
very
think roses
forgiving.
are
I
more
mean,
forgiving than people
yeah,
give
they
them credit
really
for.
are. I mean, yeah, that's why I say, if you prune a main cane back accidentally on a climber too hard, don't worry about it. It'll grow another one. It'll grow back. So don't worry about it.
Hmm.
Yeah, I see a question on tree roses. Shall we take that one?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, because that's another mystery. So thank you for asking that very much, Peggy. We appreciate that. So again, you have the stem that the tree rose is on. Then you have the head. That's the actual rose itself. Again, dead wood, twiggy growth, things along those lines. Outside of that, just prune the shape. Don't worry about, again, if you can get it butt eyes that face away, but just kind of prune that tree rose to shape. So again, a light hand, prune it to shape, and a good way to go.
And then Christy says she has, this is also two tree roses. Nice. She has a hybrid tea rose that continues to bloom throughout the season as a single rose per stem. Oh, no, she's asking, does a hybrid tea rose, I cannot talk. My goodness. Does a hybrid tea rose continue to bloom throughout the season as a single rose per stem? There we
So,
go.
Christy, that goes back to a little what we talked about in the beginning. If you prune it, the hybrid tea rose very, very hard, it's going to produce single stems with one rose on the single stem. If you prune it a little bit taller, you don't. I mean, hybrid teas by nature are one bloom per stem, but you're going to get shorter stems but more flowers. So again, if your goal with that hybrid tea rose is lots and lots of flowers, but not necessarily having really long stems, prune it to maybe 2.5 feet, 3 feet even, or something like that. If your goal is the long stems, go ahead and whack it back about 12 to 18 inches.
And how do you handle a rose that hasn't been pruned in years? Do you recommend people kind of taking a whack at it or taking it step by step over the course of a couple years?
Step by step over the course of a couple of years. Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead and clean out the dead wood, clean out the obvious stuff. Look for the oldest, most unproductive cane. Take that one off the ground. Just do one on an old rose, just one. And then just step back and see what the rose does. If the rose starts to throw out new canes from the base, which hopefully they will, then that gives you permission next year to take out another cane or two. And again, it's a 3 to 4 year project to rejuvenate an old rose that hasn't been touched in a long time.
Mm-hmm. What about unhealthy growth on a rose? What should people look for in terms of unhealthy rose growth, and how can pruning help address it?
Yeah, so pruning can help address that. So unhealthy growth can be, sometimes it's a lot of like splotches on it or something like that. Even though reddish splotches on green canes is fairly normal, so don't be surprised by that. A white scale is also a scale that can be true with horticultural oil. Look for gashes, look for cuts in the rose or something along those lines. That's telling you it's unhealthy. An open wound that's been opened up by maybe a chewing insect or something like that. The best thing to do is prune below any of that damaged or diseased growth and cut it off and get it out of there. And that's where the rule of thumb about don't prune too low goes out the window. And we talked last week briefly. You can start at the top of a cane or wherever it is and start clipping. And as long as you see white growth, you're in good shape. But if you see brown center or brown pith is what they call it, that part of the cane is dead. So just keep going until you see green growth. But yes, absolutely. That's one of the chores in wintertime pruning is to make sure you're pruning out any damaged or diseased growth.
And what about, this is kind of a whole other ball game, but looking for basically Dr. Huey trying to break out of a rose. What do people
Ah,
look
lovely, Dr.
for?
Huey. Yeah, so let me explain a little bit. Dr. Huey is if you ever bought a rose and all of a sudden you have this like little semi-double red flower in the springtime on probably a fairly long cane, that's Dr. Huey. Dr. Huey is a very commonly used understock or rootstock in the United States. It's the most commonly used one. You won't see evidence of that until spring when it actually flowers, but it's blatantly obvious what it is. You want to follow that cane all the way down to where it contacts the plant. It's probably going to be in the roots, so you're probably going to have to dig down into the soil to get it out of there. and with your secateurs, literally almost carve it off the root in order to make it go away. If you just prune it down to the ground, it's just going to get angry and throw out 3 more canes, and that's basically what it's going to do. So look out for
And
the
if you
Dr.
don't,
Hughes.
it will take over your rose.
Yeah, they call it a sucker because what it does is, since it's attached to the root system, it sucks the nutrients out of the plant before it actually gets to the actual plant itself.
Mm.
Yeah.
So everyone be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, look out. Yeah, little semi-double red flower, blatant, and it only blooms in the spring. So just be on the lookout for that.
We just have a couple more minutes, guys. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and we're happy to get to that before we wrap up here. Are there any pruning strategies that help maximize blooms throughout the growing season?
Yeah, that's what I talked about earlier. The higher you prune, the more blooms you're generally going to get. Because if you think about it, if I prune the 3 stems or 4 stems on a rose, I'm going to have 1 flower, 1 flower, 1 flower, 1 flower. Now, if I prune higher and leave more stems that are branched off those lower stems, now I've got 10 stems. Now I'm going to have 10 roses. So that's why the pruning higher is going to give you basically more flowers. And since I'm pruning myself for my garden, I want lots and lots of bloom. That's why I tend to prune very, very high. The exception is if a rose is struggling, like we talked about earlier with the 1 cane wonders, I will go ahead and just whack it back, and it's sink or swim. Either you make it or you're gone.
Charlotte just asked for clarification on the subject of a very old rose that has a woody base. Should she prune down to where she sees green, or is it okay to go down to the woody area? She's guessing the rose is at least 20 years old.
So what I would do, Charlotte, is, again, let's go slow with this thing. Let's go ahead and prune down to the green, so you make sure the rose has got foliage and contain its time. Then maybe take one of the woody canes and prune one of the woody canes maybe to like 12 to 18 inches, and let's see what happens. Let's see if new growth starts to come out from that woody cane. If all of a sudden new canes start to come out, maybe you pruned it to 12 inches and you've got a new cane coming out at 4 inches. Well, then you can cut out everything above that 4-inch new growth, and that'll form your new cane. So you have to kind of go slow, see how the rose reacts, and then basically your next step is based on how the rose reacts. But Charlotte, I would go very, very slow. Look at that as like a 3 or 4 year project to rejuvenate that rose.
Also, this feels like a good time to plug your Facebook group, because I was just thinking she could also take a picture of her rose and pop it in to see Paul Zimmerman. Is it Roses and Gardening, I think?
It's just Paul Zimmerman Roses Gardening. Yeah, Charlotte, if you just ask to be admitted, we'll admit. And actually, do post photographs, because having visuals like photographs is a real big help. And we got a lot of good experts on that page as well.
Yeah, people are really happy to help you. It's a really collaborative, great group to join. So everyone go join. If you're interested more in really that gardening community, you can go join Paul's Facebook group.
Yeah, and my group is a safe space for beginners. I'm really adamant about that. A lot of times people make rose growing too intimidating and make it too difficult, or So again, if you're a beginner.
Oh no, looks like we lost Paul. Oh dear. We were saying though that roses are more forgiving than I think people give them credit for. So really, if you go slow, they will be. Oh, he's back. I was trying to finish your thought for you.
It happened last week. Why break a streak?
This is getting to be funny now. This is turning into a farce.
It is, I know.
Not even any bad weather. Any final thoughts for Charlotte about her woody rose?
No, Charlotte, like I said, just go slow. Take it easy. That'd be my advice.
How does deadheading differ from pruning? And should we deadhead versus prune more aggressively? When should we deadhead versus prune more aggressively?
Fabulous question. So deadheading is essentially cutting off the old flower to stimulate new flowers. Because what the roses does, like any one plant, it wants to reproduce. So it flowers, and if you don't cut the flower, that becomes a hip, which is that berry. That's the seed pod. And that means it's done its job. It's reproduced itself, for lack of a better word. So by cutting off that hip or the seed pod, or by deadheading, it says, okay, now I'm going to make a new flower. So that's the art. That's what deadheading does. Yes, you can deadhead a lot more aggressively than people do. I'm a big believer in aggressive deadheading. So that's the time to do like you get your big spring flush, your big spring flowering. The roses maybe shot up to it's 6 feet. You'd like to keep it 4 feet. Deadhead it to 4 feet. There's nothing wrong with doing that. My rule of thumb is take off no more than about a third. That's my rule of thumb. But yes, you can deadhead quite aggressively. It's a great way to shape the bush all season long.
Well, I don't know about everybody listening, but I am feeling inspired. And next Tuesday, we are going to discuss all sorts of fun things: spring preparation, laying the groundwork in the
Yeah.
garden, mulching, fertilizing, and really kind of the summer care of roses. So I saw a couple of questions about like fertilizer and things. We're going to do a whole live about that next Tuesday at the same time, which is what time was it? 4 p.m.
4,
Eastern, 3
4
p.m.
Eastern time.
Central.
Yeah.
Yes. But first, we have pretty exciting news. We have our rose winners. So
Yay!
hopefully everyone is listening and is still joining us. So the winners of Jackson and Perkins roses are Charlotte Woods Cochran, Raina Miller, Barbara Riley, Laura Nelson, Cherie Wright, and John Capizzi. So, oh yay! Okay, it just got on the screen for us. We're so fancy over here with Jackson and Perkins. And you can DM Jackson and Perkins to claim your prize. Just tell them, hey, I'm a rose winner from the Facebook Live, and they have your names already. So be sure and don't forget, if you haven't done so already, to follow Jackson and Perkins on Facebook and Instagram, and you can go shop all of their wonderful roses. We do have just a couple of questions here I want to get to.
Sure.
We had, let's see, Katie asks, I have this little rose plant my husband got me for Valentine's Day. It's supposed to be planted in the spring. I have it under a grow light and I've been watering it once a week, but it's died back.
Yeah, go ahead and Katie, cut the dead growth back. I would actually get out from underneath the grow light. Watering once a week is probably pretty good. If you can get it into if you can plant it outside, if you have no chance of frost, go ahead and plant it outside. If not, maybe put it in a pot, put it outside like we talked about last week. If it's going to freeze, bring it back in an unheated building, but it wants sun is basically what it wants. Yeah.
And she says she's brand new to plants. So Katie, we're so happy to have you here and happy gardening. Yes, it probably wants sun. So don't be afraid to pop it outside. Like Paul said, to put it in, go ahead and put it in a container if you still have a fear of freeze, but otherwise you can put it outside and it's probably going to be a pretty happy camper.
Yeah. And Katie said it's wilting. Katie's probably being underwater. That would be my guess.
Mm-hmm.
But feel free to take some photographs and pop it to my Facebook group. I can take a better look at it there.
Yes, perfect. Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining again. I'm Katie Rose Watson. My website is therosetable.com. If you want to see my garden, just click on the gardening tab on the Rose Table and be sure to follow on Facebook and Instagram. I will be posting tons of garden pictures, especially here in the next couple weeks because I'm already getting some good blooms. And Paul, tell them where to find you.
I'm paulzimmermanroses.com. That's my website, my Facebook group, Paul Zimmerman Roses Gardening. And the last thing I can tell you is if you're new to pruning, don't be afraid. Take it easy. You can't make a mistake. The rose will grow back. So just go for it.
Yes. Perfect note to end on. Well, thank you all. And please join us next Tuesday at the same time for some more garden inspiration and rose growing tips. Thank you, Paul.